So good morning and welcome. My name is Reverend Dr. Ron Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to the Center for Spiritual Living Space Coast Sunday morning service. And we are going to begin this morning with my wife, Becky, who's a practitioner emeritus, opening us with a prayer. And then our congregant, Barbara Loftus, will be doing a spiritual reading. But before they do that, I want to start, as we always do, telling you, if you've never been to a Center for Spiritual Living before, we believe there's one God, many paths to that God, and we're here to love, honor, and support you, no matter what your divine path is. And the Center for Spiritual Living Space Coast is a safe haven for people of all beliefs and lifestyles, whoever you are, and wherever you find yourself on your spiritual journey of faith. You are welcome here. With that, Becky will lead us in prayer.
And so let's just take a moment just to turn within to that place of oneness, to that place of peace, that place of love. And I'm knowing my oneness in spirit, in this divine oneness. And I'm knowing this for each person here. That right here, right now, that this wonderful divine presence, this infinite love is right here within each and every one of us. And as we open up our hearts and our minds, allowing spirit to express its love through us, as us, and for us, this morning unfolds in divine perfection. I'm knowing that as Spirit is guiding and directing Reverend Dr. Ron's message, his words, his heart is expressing also so clearly that it reaches our hearts, opens up our consciousness, our awareness, it deepens it. It deepens our heart. And so I'm knowing that this morning is one that is led by this divine spirit. It fills us with its wisdom, with the knowledge that is already here within each and every one of us. And so knowing this, knowing that this morning is in its divine perfection already, I give thanks, I release it, and just know that it is done, and so it is.
So now Barbara Loftus is going to do a spiritual reading for us.
Thank you. Can everyone see me?
Yeah, you're
Okay.
fine.
All right. So the reading is from Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And I don't know if all of you know, C.S. Lewis is the one who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And this particular book, Mere Christianity, was written around the time of the Second World War, which I think provides some context for the subject that he's speaking of. And the subject is forgiveness. Suppose one reads a story of filthy atrocities in the paper. Then suppose that something turns up suggesting that the story might not be quite true or not quite so bad as it was made out. Is one's first feeling, thank God, even they aren't quite so bad as that? Or is it a feeling of disappointment and even a determination to cling to the first story for the sheer pleasure of thinking your enemies as bad as possible? If it is the second, then it is, I am afraid, the first step in a process which, if followed to the end, will make us into devils. You see, one is beginning to wish that black was a little blacker, that if we wish its head, that if we give that wish its head, later on we shall wish to see gray as black, and then to see white itself as black. Finally, we shall insist on seeing everything, God and our friends and ourselves included, as bad and not be able to stop it. We shall be fixed forever in a universe of pure hatred. Now, a step further, does loving your enemy mean not punishing him? No. We may punish if necessary, but we must not enjoy it. In other words, something inside us, the feeling of resentment, the feeling that wants to get its own back, must be simply killed. I do not mean that anyone can decide this moment that he will never feel it anymore. That is not how things happen. I mean that every time it bobs its head up, day after day, year after year, all our lives long, we must hit it on its head. It is hard work, but the attempt is not impossible. Even while we punish, we must try to feel about the enemy as we feel about ourselves, to wish that he were not bad, to hope that he may, in this world or another, be cured. In fact, to wish his good. That is what is meant in the Bible by loving him. Wishing his good, not feeling fond of him or saying he is nice when he is not.
Thank you, Barbara. So, as you can guess, this morning, I want to speak on forgiveness as a spiritual practice. You know, once a year, I like to do a spiritual message. Today's the day. And what I want to do is I want to begin. I thought it would be interesting to see what some spiritual writers and spiritual leaders, how they define forgiveness. So I want to do that with a couple. And the first one is Joan Borisenko, who talks about it and says that forgiveness is an exercise of compassion, that it's both a process and an attitude. And I'll talk about that process piece a little bit later. And another writer, Philip Moffat, says forgiveness is a practice about liberating your own feelings and finding meaning in the worst of life's events. So he's saying, you know, even when we've been hurt, when we feel like we've been marginalized, when life hurts, that if we do some forgiveness work, we can find meaning in that, and we can move beyond the pain. Jack Kornfield, who's a Buddhist teacher, says forgiveness can help end suffering and bring dignity and harmony to our life. And Tian Dayton says forgiveness is a process. There's that word again, a process, and not an event. And it takes work, and it doesn't happen all at once. And he says, and it may not happen completely. And I'm going to talk about that again later on also. You know, in our life, we all have pain, but we have a choice how much we suffer. And years ago, when Becky and I started out in Science of Mind, we went to the church in Huntington Beach, and Peggy Bassett was our minister, and she used to say all the time that in life, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. So forgiveness allows us to be in charge of our own experience rather than being tossed around by somebody else's actions. It's a gift we give ourselves. And Oprah said, if you need to forgive somebody, let it be the best gift that you give yourself. And she said it's a gift for all seasons. You know, she also said she had a forgiveness expert on her show one day speaking about forgiveness. And he said, forgiveness means giving up all hope for having a better past, for giving up all hope for having a better past. And, you know, to me, what that means is we can't change the past, but we can see it in a different light. We can see it in a different way. You know, forgiveness is something that we do for ourselves. It's not something we do for the other person. We let go of pain and we move on for our own sake. It's like getting rid of a sack of rocks that we're carrying around on our back. And when we don't forgive people, we hold them in our life. They stay in our life because we're thinking about them, maybe even all the time. Some of us, I know I've done this, obsess on it, so that instead of letting them move on and be out of our life, they continue to be right there. You know, I am sure everybody listening to this today, or whenever you're going to listen to it and see it, we all have been hurt. We all have been treated unfairly. And so we get the choice. We can hold on to that pain, but holding on to it, it takes energy and it takes effort. And when we do, it saps our aliveness and it shuts us down. And when we hang on to it, this is the other part that to me is so ironic. When we hold on to it, we aren't punishing the other person because they go on with their life. So, you know, we can be thinking how miserable they are and how much they hurt us and everything else, and they're going on living their life just the way they've always lived it, and we're the ones that are suffering. You know, I've heard this before many years ago, that holding on to resentment is like us drinking poison and waiting for the other person to keel over. Wayne Dyer, in one of his books, he tells a story of him himself and how his father left the family. And in fact, Wayne Dyer never ever knew his family, and he was in foster homes. And he nobody would talk to him about his dad. His mom's side of the family wouldn't, and his dad's side didn't want him to find his dad because they thought he'd go after him for back child support. And he decided he wanted to find him. And eventually, it's a long story. He finds his dad's grave, and he goes there and he speaks to the grave for hours, yelling and asking, "Why did you do this?" etc. And all of a sudden, he said a peace came over him, and he just looked down, and he said he felt like his dad was there. And he finally said, "You know what? I give it all up. I forgive you. I forgive you, and I send you love." And Dyer said, after he did that, his whole life turned around. His whole life changed because he felt like a weight was taken off his shoulders. And he said, you know, when we forgive, what we're saying is, I no longer give you the power to control who I am, how I think, and how I behave in the future. I take responsibility for all that right now. So we let go of blame and take responsibility for our own actions. You know, we can choose not to focus on our wounded feelings, because that gives the other person power over us. We can choose to live in the future. I mean, to live in the present and not in the past. Because, you know, I guess I said this before, holding a grudge, it drains us. And letting go might not be easy. I'm not saying any of this is easy, particularly when somebody hurts us deeply, but it's worth the peace of mind that it gets us. You know, there's an old story about two monks who meet after not seeing one another for years. And they had been held years ago in the same prison where they knew one another and where they were both tortured. After all these years, they meet. One says to the other, "Have you forgiven them?" And the second one says, "No, I'll never forgive them." And the first one says to him, "Well, I guess they still have you in prison, don't they?" You know, years ago, I think I've talked about this before, Becky and I took my youngest son to the Holocaust Museum in LA when we lived in Southern California. And at the end of the experience, they had a special guest speaker that day. And she was a lady who had been in a concentration camp during World War II. And she was giving a talk. And after her talk, I was still in the School of Ministry then, and I was doing a paper on forgiveness. So I went up to her, and she shook my hand, and she held on to my hand. And I said, I have a question. And she said, what's your question? And I started to say, tell me, after all these years, can. And she stopped me. She put her hand on my wrist, and she finished my question. She said, can I forgive? And I said, that's my question. And she said, of course I can forgive. If I hadn't forgive them, the hate would have killed me by now. So I thought it would be interesting to look at what Jesus says about forgiveness. So I want to tell you 3 things he says about it. First, one of the disciples says, so how often must I forgive? 7 times 7? And Jesus says to him, no, 70 times 7, meaning that forgiveness is a continual process. And he has 2 parables on forgiveness that I want to share with you. The first one is he talks about a king who has a subject that owes him a lot of money. And the king is about to put the subject, his wife, and his entire family, he's about to sell them into slavery. And this subject begs him, please have more patience. Give me a little more time. And somehow the way he says it and what he says, it really plays on the king's compassion. And the king winds up forgiving his entire debt. And so this subject goes and he celebrates. And as he's celebrating, he sees somebody else who owes him money. And he confronts him. And this fellow says to him, can you give me some more time? And he says no. And he has him thrown into prison. And after he does that, some of the fellow who's in prison, some of his friends go to see the king. And they tell the king what he's done. And the king has the unmerciful servant thrown back into prison until he can pay his entire debt. And the moral of the story is it's impossible to be forgiven unless you forgive. We can't receive what we refuse to give. And if you think about that on a different level, if we refuse to give love, we're not going to get it back. If we refuse to give kindness, we're not going to get it back. If we refuse to be compassionate, we're not going to get it back. And so when we refuse to give anything, we don't receive it. We don't receive it. And the other parable that Jesus talks about is about the lady who committed adultery. And a group brings this lady before Jesus, and the law says she should be stoned to death. And Jesus says to her, to them rather, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And they, yes, feel pretty embarrassed, and they drop their stones and walk away. And Jesus says, where did they go? She says, I don't know. And he said, no, they didn't judge you, and neither will I. Go now and sin no more. And what he's saying there is forgiveness is not an excuse. Rather, forgiveness is not an excuse. Sinning. So I want to read a quote to you from Khalil Gibran. He wrote, I have learned silence from the talkative, tolerance from the intolerant, kindness from the unkind. Yet strange, I am ungrateful to these teachers. And so what he's really saying to us is we can thank these teachers because they teach us how to be the best us. They teach us how to be the best we can be. We learn from them how we don't want to behave, how when somebody hurts us, we don't want to turn around and do that back. So I want to go on and speak to you about some misconceptions about forgiveness. I want to speak about 5 or 6 misconceptions about what forgiveness is. One of them is forgiving means we condone the behavior. So, if your partner has committed adultery or had an affair, it doesn't mean we condone it, but you don't have to keep suffering either. So years ago, I wrote a really, really personal article in Science of Mind magazine about my own experience with my ex-wife committing adultery and me getting to a place of forgiveness. So I want to read you just a small part of the article, not to say, geez, aren't I great on terms of forgiveness, but to show even from your deepest pain, we don't condone it and we can move on. So I wrote this. The first part of the article I wrote was about how I found out what was happening. And years later, I wrote this second part. And I started it out by saying, I must have reread part 1 10 times this week. I can't believe how much time has passed since that night. The bitterness is all gone, disappearing into the ethers with the marriage. The children are grown and they have lives of their own. And I sit here at the computer pondering what I have learned in the years that have passed. And am I really healed or just covering up the scam? What would I say today to the characters that played a part in this? And the first one I wrote about was Barbara. And I said, first, I would say I forgive you. As I look back now, I can see that you must have felt isolated and alone because I was working long hours on a new job and he was there. It doesn't excuse what you did, but I realized you weren't the horrible person I portrayed you to be. I am sorry for the names I called you, the years of anger, and the part I played in making the ensuing years so unpleasant. It was always easier to blame you than take responsibility for my behavior. I also want to thank you for the good news. You took great care of me, and while I might have forgotten them during the difficulty, I remember now, and I appreciate all your efforts and the love we shared. Thank you, and I forgive you. A second misconception is that we have to reconcile. You can forgive somebody who abused you, and you can end contact with them right there. Forgiving is for your peace of mind, a healing in your life. The third misconception, or a third misconception, is it depends on whether or not they apologize first to you. If we let another person determine if we heal, that means we're giving them power over us. They can't stop us from healing. So it doesn't depend at all on them apologizing. Forgiveness is something we do internally. So here's a fourth one. We have to forgive and forget. No, we don't have to forgive and forget, but we don't have to dwell on it either. If somebody abused you, it's not a good idea to forget it. You maybe want to forgive it. You definitely want to forgive it, but it doesn't mean you want to forget it and go back into a relationship with them. You want to remember it and just let it be. Another one is, if I forgive my relationship, my if I forgive, my relationship with the other person will improve. You know, not necessarily. You may never ever even see them again. And in fact, you don't even have to tell them. I read something this week about a lady who was abused by somebody when she was in college in her 20s. And she finally reported him. And 20 years later, she went back to tell him she forgives him. And he said, well, I forgive you for reporting me. And I forgive you for ruining my life. And I forgive you for my marriage breaking up and blah, blah, blah. And she realized he was just being sarcastic. And the point is, she could have forgiven him without ever talking to him. You know, a few years ago, when we first moved here, somebody did something to me that was incredibly hurtful. And it ended our relationship. And a few years ago, I said to Becky, you know what? I'm going to call her and tell her I forgive her. And Becky said to me, why would you do that? She probably she doesn't care at all whether you forgive her or whether you don't. So rather than calling her and probably having a really unpleasant conversation, why not just forgive her in your mind and in your heart and let it go? And let me tell you the last misconception. I only need to forgive once. No, we may need to forgive over and over. Process. It takes time. You know, I think it was Joan Borysenko I first read that said, we forgive over and over, and it's like peeling an onion. Each time we forgive, we go deeper and deeper and deeper. I read something this week by Gary Zukav, and it's a story he told about people sitting around in a circle. And here's how it goes. Kill him, said the mother. Kill him, said the brother. Kill him, said the sister. They were talking about the fate of a young man who had killed one of their family members, his best friend. And after all of these people, he's sitting outside the circle. After all of these people within the circle talked about killing him, grandfather spoke up and said, will killing him return our boy? And they said no. And he said, will killing him bring more food to our people? And they said no. And he said, so let's take time to think about this. So they take some time, they debate it, and they call him into the circle after several hours. Grandfather says, see that teepee? That's the teepee of the person you killed. It's yours now. See those horses? They were his. Now they're yours. You will take the place in our family of the one you have killed. And Zukov goes on to say this happened in the late 1800s. And what happened is this person became a devoted son. And by the time he died, he was known in all the tribes as the model of a loving son. The point of the story, obviously, is that's what forgiveness can do. So I want to close with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who said, he who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. The work of forgiving begins within. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we're less prone to hate our enemies. God bless you all. Thank you for being here. Have a great week.